All right, time to pick back up here. Hopefully you're enjoying your experience along the way. By the way, there's your carnival. Looks like a good time to cut loose into before times when you could have this sort of event without having to worry about social distancing and all that kind of nonsense. I was back into before times, the carefree times, before there was germ theory, before there were plagues, um, all that kind of fun stuff. Um, so now what we're seeing here is the institution of the church starting to change. So just a few minor points on this is the the time of the Catholic the Catholics and the Protestants have learned to finally accept each other by the end of this time period for the most part. It'll become more of a friendly rivalry rather than to kill each other over it sort of thing. Um, the Catholics are going to drop the Jesuits. You may remember them being the pretty aggressively Catholics there for a while. And we're going to start seeing, depending on where we live in Europe, but don't trust this to last, the toleration of religious minorities for the most part. Um, excuse me. So we're going to start seeing at this time toleration for Jews. Now, of course, as you know, it's not going to last. The toleration of religious minorities, unfortunately, in history, is oftentimes only until um, we need someone to blame for a problem. Um, so, if I've got my vocabulary terms right, Ashkenazic Jews were the ones who lived more along Northern Europe, along France, along Germany, and they became more accepted in society there. And remember, if we go back to Louis XIV in the last unit, Louis XIV did not have religious tolerance. He actually revoked the edicts that allowed religious minorities to have recognition. So a lot of religious minorities began settling in modern day Germany. And so by the time you get to World War II and the Holocaust, for instance, um, and so when we see that they're no longer accepted there under the reign of Hitler, the reason there were so many of them settling in Germany was because if you go back to the Spanish Inquisition, they're not welcome in Spain. If you go back to the era of Louis XIV and the near century, it seems like he seems to rule France. I mean, it's 72 years, but give me a break. Um, they were no longer accepted there. They just had to keep moving throughout Europe. And the places that all the Jews end up settling in ends up being modern day Poland, modern day Germany, to some degree, a little bit more to the south, towards the south of France, to Italy. And some start settling throughout the Middle East. And there's different experiences there. At this time, to live in northern France, and sort of communities where they were accepted, along Denmark, for instance, along the borders of France, rather, towards Germany. They're accepted. They're members of the community. They're doing well. The usury laws had worked out to their favor religiously, which started leading to some stereotypes about the Jews. Enlightenment thinkers often accepted them. Remember, Enlightenment thinkers, a lot of them are not, I would argue, had they, the ones who stood on their shoulders moving forward with science and with theory, I would argue that many of them, had they been the ones to come later, probably would have been atheist. So Enlightenment thinkers are, when they're starting to say men are created equal, remember we talked about in the last videos, that does not mean that they are accepting of ethnic minorities. It doesn't mean they're accepting of religion, or of women rather. But many of them are willing to accept religious minorities, and they are willing to make sessions and say that a Jew is equal to a Christian, which at that time is a major step of a thing to say. Um, and certainly welcome to the Jews, of course. And we're going to talk about Joseph II later. Reforms and acceptance, partially. Sometimes there ends up being a situation where a society also needs the Jews for the influence they could bring to a community, and what they may be able to do, usually in terms of merchants or banking or whatnot. So some communities kind of accept the Jews out of more, we need them more than they need us. Um, All right, so let's move on. So where's their majorities? So as you can see here, a map. The East has pretty much always been Orthodox Christianity. The Middle East is a settling into a Muslim majority, has been at that point for 1,000 years pretty much. And Europe, for the most part, Catholic, or South and Central Europe, Western Europe, mostly Catholic. And that's pretty much the patterns that are going to be established for a while to come. Um, so let's talk about what starts happening with with religion. In particular, here a new religion shows up that's kind of founded in um, some of the theories around the Enlightenment. But if you look at root words, Methodism has methods. It is a more modern, progressive. It's kind of a form of Christianity for the thinking man to some degree. It accepts reasoning and science and incorporates that with the religion, and accepts the certain mysticisms about God, but also accepts certain realities and the such of science and thought. The thinker who, or the man associated with founding of Methodism. And then we'll skip on, and we're going to have to wrap up with enlightened absolutism. Um, Arguably, they are not enlightened. Arguably, they are not even absolutes. And these are basically an enlightened absolute is anyone who had correspondence and thoughts with Enlightenment philosophers, which to some degree goes back to even Louis XIV. I mean, he had correspondence with some of these people who were getting involved in science and Enlightenment thought, but they're usually associated with the rulers who fall on the later end of period two's time period. Um, and there's definitely an argument. There's a John Green video that'll go over this in way better detail than I ever could. They arguably never exist anyway, um, but they follow to certain degrees. The three that are mostly associated with, you will notice there are some differences here. Joseph II, Frederick II of Prussia, and Catherine the Great of Russia. They are mostly Central and Eastern Europeans, whereas your absolute monarchs were Western, if you ever had to compare it. They were more French, Spanish, well, not Spanish, but English or French for the most part. Um, However, they only saw the Enlightenment as something that could possibly lead to a better way of thinking and a better way of advancing the empire as well. Remember, Louis XIV has a use for science and Enlightenment as long as it advances the needs of the state, as well as the English Royal Society. Same degree there. So first off, Frederick William I, who builds up an army of several 100,000 people, the Junkers there just being the nobles. And it has been said that Prussia was a country, or was an army with a country rather than a country with an army. And so that the ideas of professional standing military with modern tactics, that was the sort of thing that was a useful piece of science and enlightenment that they could capitalize on. Frederick II, um, which is where Voltaire ends up kind of in default because the French wouldn't put up with him. But he's open to listening to Voltaire and gave him a place to be and write. And we see someone kind of making sessions. I would argue that absolutes are in a spot where they make rules they can enforce rather than make rules they can enforce and take a fall for it. So remember, there were people who were being kicked out of France, and they were like, we could build a good society if we accept some of these religious minorities, such as the Jews and the such. So let's grant them freedom of religion. Let's grant them some freedom of speech. Let's grant them things that would pull them out of France and let them come here. And so you could argue, was religious toleration something they gave them out of moral goodwill, or was it something more out of a necessity to the state? You could certainly make an argument both ways there, and could probably make a good argument for it was actually the needs of the state that fit that. Um, and so enlightened just basically means they actually understood the ideas of the philosophers rather than just totally blew them off and accepted tradition. Whereas James I or Louis XIV certainly ruled by divine right. Frederick II is more likely to take a Thomas Hobbes style approach and say, I rule because my intellect, my ability to keep the people in line is necessary, if that makes sense. So remember, he is dependent on his nobles, his Junkers. And we do start seeing some reforms in that we see, I talked about the middle, there wasn't like a set day we can say, here's the day serfdom ended. It's not like you can take, well, here's the day the Emancipation Proclamation happened, or here's the day Juneteenth. This was the clear end of things. This was the beginning of a new era. Arguably, those aren't the beginning of a new era either. But that was probably not the best example, as there was certainly a progression from slavery to where we're at now. In that sense, there's also a progression of serfdom to where you're at now. There is no clear-cut date where serfdom ends. There is, however, it's going to be chipping away at it. And so we're going to see with Joseph II, it'll kind of go away. What does gain him is he starts expanding the lands. And what we're going to start seeing here is a need of Germany, where it's been like, what is Germany? And so there's a group of German-speaking people, but they have a lot of different city-states. I mean, is Austria German or is it German? What about Poland? What rivers make it up? There's certainly a lot of thoughts about what should make up Germany. And to some degree, to take that up to an area that you may know more about from world history and study coming into my class, when Hitler starts partitioning Austria, when he wants to take Czechoslovakia, to some degree, it's this idea of a dream that had been a thing for centuries to unite all German-speaking people under a German fatherland. And so we see that to some degree with Frederick the Great trying to unite Prussia. Didn't talk too much about Maria Theresa. She's mentioned in the book. Make sure you read about her there. Where we do end up, though, is with Joseph II. And if any of these enlightened monarchs are enlightened, it is him. And he actually starts moving towards abolishing serfdom in Germany. It will later be abolished in Russia. He starts establishing certain, religious toleration, equality before the law, for the Junkers, for the common people, for the Jews, for the Protestants, for the Catholics, which is a major step there, by the way. And see some other things that even could be seen as a massive step forward, even in the 21st century, abolishing torture and ending the death penalty. And in America today, we've seen those are still issues now. So he was a little bit ahead of his time in that sense. But in doing so, establishing religious toleration is kind of going to put you on bad terms with the Catholic Church back then. And there were a lot of non-German people who lived in the land. Remember, we've expanded over towards Poland, and there's a sort of like a Polish people. The Jews, which have their own native language as well, with Hebrew, to some degree with Yiddish. Establishing like an official language. I mean, with every monarch, you can always say, here's what they did, it was good. Here's what they did, it might have been bad. And establishing that Deutsche is the official language, the German language, is starting that whole unite the fatherland sort of thing, but it also to some degree alienates people who are living under his land, such as in Poland, such as for the Jews. And he also taken away the nobles' people to some degree. That's, anytime you upset a balance of power, anytime you flip over a way of doing things that has been established for a long time, there's going to be a lot of resistance. And you see that even today. Humans are people of habit. So after Peter the Great, there's not too many great people after him. So we're going to get to Peter the Third, who dies, wink, wink, possibly at the hands of Catherine the Great. I didn't say she killed her, did he? Maybe she did. We'll see. She had something to do with it. I'm just saying, conspiracy. So Catherine the Great, actually, she's in correspondence with Voltaire, for instance, I believe. I believe she was in correspondence with Voltaire. She was in correspondence with somebody. But she starts this pendulum, remember, that we've talked about in class before, where Russia has favoritism towards West, and then they get kind of anti-West sentiment. And Catherine the Great is one who follows pro-West sentiments, and she follows the ideals of some of these Enlightenment philosophers. However, they don't really make much progress on it. But, she did have a lot of sympathy for it. She does start trying to divide up the country in a way that Western countries were divided, dividing up states and nobility and giving the nobilities the right to rule their area to some extent, kind of establishing like a pyramid structure where, you have one layer, and then you all come up to a top where you'd have a king in the West. She tries to organize in that way. What does kind of come back to bite them in Russia, Pugachev's rebellion, which is ultimately not going to, I guess you would say, not necessarily accomplish too much in the grand scheme of things, but it does show some resistance of the peasants to what's going on there. to mandatory military service, to taxes, where they actually overthrow and they try to kill a lot of the um, the nobles of Russia at that time. The government ultimately wins that revolt, but it does show the idea that common people are realizing that they don't like their status as much. And so we always see people wanting more rights, which um, we always see, like, we always want what the higher up people in society have. We want the same rights. We want the same opportunities they have. We want the opportunities to advance ourselves. And even if we don't necessarily want to be a president, for instance, we would like the ability to be able to go for it. But the way Catherine the Great kind of responds is when she puts down the rebellion, kind of putting the serfs back in their place. Now, Poland, I've got a meme about Poland I need to send out sometime. Send me a message in your mind. Ask me to send out the Polish memes. Poland has been controlled by pretty much everyone in Europe at some point in its history. It doesn't really have a defensible border like a river or a mountain range or anything. There's not really a clear designation of what is Poland, where is Poland. Its borders have been all over the place throughout history. And so it ends up at this time, it's kind of divided up among Russia, Prussia. Anywho, let's move on to the failure of enlightened despots. The thing is, none of them, despite knowing about the Enlightenment, knowing what the failures of absolutes were, according to Enlightenment philosophers, none of them are willing to give up their power for it. And they actually, for the most part, establish more autocracy. In the cases of a place like Russia, where European society likes having classes, Russia starts moving towards that. They oftentimes taxed unfairly and had frequent wars. So the thing is that most Enlightenment philosophers said war was always bad, and yet these people are going to war. These people said, "Look, you got to tax. You got to tax at a certain rate. The higher ups need to pay more. The lower people need to pay less. It needs to be equal in the eyes of all people, so that everybody's paying what they legally can." And that did not happen. So really with enlightened despots, it's more like they kind of saw the idea and said, yeah, that looks like a good idea, but ultimately I'm not going to do it. Ultimately, when it comes down to it with enlightened despots, I mean, if you just look at the term despot, and if you know even anything about despotism, they don't accept the opinions of too many other people. They care more about their own power than they care about anything else. And that is true of enlightened despots. So really all they ever have is correspondence and knowledge of Enlightenment ideals, and they only implement the ones that don't threaten their power. Thank you for watching. And as you may know, as we start moving into Unit 5, Unit 6, or especially Unit 5, we're about ready to stop taking all this, and we're going to do something about it, we common people. Stay tuned.